Welcome to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, check out seanmurphy.net. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Some Things Considered. This is the podcast where we celebrate creativity. We're obsessed with storytelling, and I love to talk to interesting people and find out what makes them tick. I'm Sean Murphy, your host. I run 1455 Literary Arts. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah. You can find out more about me and this podcast at seanmurphy.net. But as I always like to say, the best part of the various roles I play is that I'm always in the position of being in contact with amazing people that I learn from. Paula Whyman, today's guest, is no exception. Let me introduce her, and then we'll dive into why she's here today to talk about her new book, Bad Naturalist. This book, which of course I was lucky enough to have an advanced reader copy of, it is available at your finest bookstores. Bad Naturalist, One Woman's Ecological Education on a Wild Virginia Mountaintop, is a blend of memoir, natural history, and conservation science. Her first book, which I also highly recommend, a linked short story collection, You May See a Stranger, won praise from the New Yorker and a starred review in Publishers Weekly. She was co-founder, editor-in-chief of the awesome literary journal Scoundrel Time, and her work on Bad Naturalist was supported in part by the Maryland State's Arts Council. Paula, thank you so much for being here. And this is it very appropriately. We did have some weather-related issues, and you're going to talk all about weather and environment and how a writer finds herself in those circumstances. But first and foremost, thank you for being here, and thank you for writing this amazing book.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to talk today.
Yeah. All right. Well, as always, I come prepared with questions, but I'm sure we'll also go down a few welcome rabbit holes. I want to set the tone by acknowledging that certain texts, and I mean, for we writers and readers tend to romanticize things, but I mean, certain books come into your life at the right time and they accrue extra layers of import. During a period when our sociopolitical realities are ugly and unceasingly in our face, it was not only welcome, but necessary to escape to nature via the written word, via your book, and be reminded that not only do bad times come and go, but we all have to do our parts to affect positive change. And we should never cease to be humbled by the enormity of nature and the history of our earth. So I thank you for that opportunity. And rather than try to summarize the book myself, I have the author here. Tell us a little bit about what this book is about, but even more so, how you came to write it, because there's a story behind the story.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm glad that the book provided some respite in dark times, difficult times. So the book, Bad Naturalist, is about my attempts to restore native meadows on a mountaintop in the foothills of the northern Blue Ridge. It's about the obstacles I encountered, the many mistakes I made, and the failures, and importantly, the successes, and the discoveries that I made along the way. So when it started out, I guess we were looking for a place in the country, my husband and I, for probably on and off for probably 30 years. But some of that was just kind of standing, on a farm field and fantasizing about it. And some of it was actual looking. And what we were really looking for was a farmhouse where I could, a little piece of land where I could plant a vegetable garden. My husband is an Eagle Scout. He's also very good with plants, actually. And so he was interested in being in the outdoors more. And uh, over the years, as we got to a point where we could actually maybe pursue this plan in earnest, when our kids who are now in their 20s were sort of needing less from us and, less of our time and so on. And it seemed more realistic to be able to make a big move. Then at that time, I was reading a lot about the importance of native plants. And I'll just back up a minute to say that I'm someone who's been passionate about nature and ecology since I was a little kid. I used to sit in my backyard and dig holes to try to find ants and worms and things like that. And I would collect live cicadas and let them crawl on my arms and legs. I was really I came to this from, that perspective of being really into bugs and wildlife. And through the years, I had done various deep dives on like a weird collection of creatures and places, like at some point or other being preoccupied with horseshoe crabs or lizards or carpenter bees. And what would happen is I'd sort of come across this topic and something would strike my interest about it, and I just had to like know everything I could find about it, and I couldn't let it go. And so with that backdrop, I was reading about native plants. I was reading, for instance, Doug Tallamy's Nature's Best Hope, which is all about his homegrown national park project, which is about bringing native plants back to replace the lawns in the suburbs, in your suburban yard, in order to benefit pollinators and birds and so on. And I had read a book called Wilding by Isabella Tree, which is all about how she allowed over 3,000 acres on her farm in England to sort of go back to nature. And she brought animals back there to mimic the behavior and impact of animals that would have naturally lived there at one time. So I had both of those stories in my mind when we were looking in earnest, maybe 5, 6 years ago. And we were here in Rappahannock County, which is where the land is located. And that's where we were focused on searching. And someone said, you should really see the view from this mountain while you're out here. I mean, we were looking, like I said, for a farmhouse, a small plot of land. I wanted to raise a few sheep. And when I say a few, I really mean like 3 or 4, not 300, And so we were like, sure, yes, that sounds great. Let's go walk up that mountain while we're here. It was August, and yes, it was hot and bright. And we got to this place and found that although it was theoretically accessible by gravel road, actually the gravel stopped somewhere near the bottom, and the rest was more of a trail because it just hadn't been used in quite a long time. It was the top of this mountain was a cattle farm for a few decades. Before that, it was an orchard, an apple orchard for about 150 years. But in the few years before we saw it, it had kind of gone to seed. And so had the one-time road. So we hiked up to the to this clearing. Well, it wasn't really a clearing. It was more of a path that was mowed, through all the vegetation that had grown up in the meantime. And it was over our heads. The plants were like over 6 feet tall, and we're sort of winding our way on this path to a high point. And when I looked out in this high point, I saw, I was standing amid all of this vegetation, and these yellow flowers were everywhere that I didn't know what they were. There were bees, and I could hear all these birds that were unfamiliar and everything. And then I look out and I see this meadow, these rolling hills, and with, punctuated by occasional trees, these forested slopes falling off around it, and these yellow flowers everywhere in what I found out was a 75 or 80 acre open meadow on top of this mountain, which is pretty unusual in the East to have open land like that, so much open land on top of a mountain. So I looked at that and I thought, okay, I had thought about planting a native meadow, you know, in line with what I had been reading about, maybe an acre, and I was going to put my little writing shed next to it so I could watch the, butterflies and like, a very delusionally idealistic, romanticized picture of how I would be living. And instead, I looked out on this vast landscape, which beyond it, I could see the Blue Ridge, I could see the Piedmonts, I could see like, you know, really far, even though the top of this mountain wasn't all that high. It was in a fortunate position, I guess. But that's why we had been told to go up there because it was so dramatic. And I looked out at that and I thought, okay, my original idea seems kind of small now and insignificant. It's not insignificant, but it seemed like it in that moment. And I thought, okay, wow, this is a meadow of sorts. It's been left alone, and who knows what's happening here. And I could really do something here. Maybe I could really make a difference here, forgetting in the moment that I didn't really know very much about plants. I had always been interested in insects and wildlife, and I came to ecology from that perspective. And I didn't even know like where to begin, what questions to ask, starting
Yeah.
with what was this yellow flower that I was seeing everywhere. I really didn't know anything. And yet here we are.
Yeah, I mean, so imagine, and I'm thinking many of the people watching this and maybe many of your readers who are of the more literary stripe. For me, glamping means going somewhere where there's one bathroom to share. So this is absolutely foreign for me. So I learned so much about the process, the humbling, kind of excruciatingly slow, very little instant gratification involved in some of the adventures that you've had, but a real appreciation for how little those of us that have grown up, in modern suburbs, how removed we are from, I mean, literally and figuratively, how profoundly removed we are from a lifestyle that probably up until the late 19th century, most humans were passingly familiar with because there weren't big cities, there weren't big urban centers. So there was a connection to the land. And so I was able to really live vicariously through your exploration, but from a very removed space, which I think in some ways makes me the ideal reader or anyone that doesn't have like anything to grasp onto. Like if you said, "What I didn't know what that yellow flower was," my first thought was, I know I wouldn't know. Um, in some ways, I think that is ideal because what your book is doing is, without a capital E, is educating, through your experience, and this kind of humility and love for the landscape comes through. I was struck. I have a few quotes that I wrote down as I was reading, but I love when you write early on. You talk about, from as a writer, an idea or a line of dialogue can spark a story. Um, and that was an idea you didn't fully fathom initiated this adventure, and then eventually you realize I have to write about this. So it was almost like this full circle. um you're one of the few contemporary people I know that is a very literary kind of, all the cliches that come with that, like cerebral, very studious, very excellent with words. But you obviously, as you've just explained, have always had an affinity for the outdoors. And I'm certainly not implying that writers don't go outside and vice versa, but for someone to be so library-esque, for what a ridiculous description, but us writery types, um, you kind of split the middle, but you saw this outdoorsy part of you really expand. And I'm curious how much of that was chicken egg. Like as you got deeper into this, you realized if I didn't enjoy this, I would quit. But you just kept going deeper and deeper.
Well, that's a really great question. And what you said about educating with a small e, I was educating myself while I was writing this book. I was doing the things that I was writing about while I was writing, and so I was really learning as I went. And one of the things that was really important to me was to write this book for someone like me who didn't really know anything when I started, and even just describing plants, I didn't want to use terminology. I wanted to describe them visually so that I could imagine what they would look like, because the terminology didn't mean anything to me. So anyway, that's a long way of saying that. Now I forgot what you asked.
Well, I was saying that yeah, I was at great pains to point out that as opposed to say the
Oh,
fish
outdoors,
water
outdoors. Yes,
story,
yes.
which is played out and could be interesting with the right writer, but this wasn't just you being dropped into an environment that
Yeah.
you had no idea, but you didn't have any idea, even with your background, how deep it was going to go and how quickly you would realize part A connects to part B and C, and if you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound.
Yeah, well, for sure. I really um I was, well, I think that we made this move because we both wanted a more outdoor life. And I mean, it sounds funny to say I wanted to be closer to nature because we are nature. We carry it around with us everywhere. But I've lived in the city in an apartment, I've lived in the suburbs for many years, and um, we tend to create these edifices around ourselves, separate ourselves with our big brains and our technological know-how and our territoriality, which a lot of species are territorial. We're just really good at it. That can make us feel like we're more separate than we really are. And I was ready to not feel that anymore in the same way. And really, I wish that I had. Um, I mean, I started to look at things differently in the suburbs also, but I wish that I had done that sooner, because when you live in the suburbs, or even in the city, wherever you're dealing with a lot of uh, nature as pests, and trying to control the environment, get the lawn to grow, the bad lawn, keep the ants out of the kitchen, keep the mice out of the basement, keep the mosquitoes out of the yard. All of that's, it's always about like, putting some barrier or obstacle or killing things, or,
Yeah.
instead of, at least from my perspective, paying attention to the good things that were happening and the promising things that were happening. And now, being in this environment, 200 acres on a mountaintop, or kind of a remote, somewhat isolated place, it's impossible to ignore that nature is just uh, um, I have to be. It's a much more physical lifestyle. I don't really have to run on the treadmill as much when I'm snowshoeing up and down the mountain road, pulling a sled full of groceries. Which, if you had asked me um, a few years ago if that's what I was going to do with those snowshoes, I would have been like, "No way! That is never going to happen." Yeah, because I mean, I think I'm willing to do all sorts of new things and trying all sorts of new things in this environment. And some are obviously forced on me like that, but others are just, okay, this has to be done. No one else is available to do it. So I'm going to take this, 20-pound weed wrench or whatever it is, and lug it around the field, and I'm going to find these trees and I'm going to pull them up, and mixed success at things like that. But how much can I do as one person? But at the same time, it is sort of kind of an empowering feeling to know that, like, actually I can still do these things. And I'm not like so physically atrophied, and
Right. Right.
and also you know mentally, intellectually, I'm at a point in my life, or was at a point in my life, where I could have just kept going in the same sort of groove I was in, writing the kinds of stories that I was writing the kinds of books that I was thinking about, um, volunteering for the things I was anyway, the point is that I I somehow decided in that moment that I was going to take on this very ambitious challenge that would force me to learn something entirely new, to do a project that was not like anything I'd ever done before, despite my longtime interest in ecology and conservation biology and so on. And that was kind of, I mean, it was a leap, and it's a leap I recommend to everyone. It doesn't have to be about nature, it can be about anything that you feel passionate about.
Yeah, thank you for articulating that so beautifully. Yeah, one of the words I thought of a lot while I was reading your book was the notion of surrender, but a very, as opposed to a passive surrender, like an active. And I don't know if there's anything like nature that will remind us that we've spent the better part of a century. Entire industries exist to separate us from nature. Now we have, of course, devices that distract us even from having to think and having to lift a finger. So to say that your book and the experiences you describe are kind of a slowing down, it's really a corrective to so much. I alluded at the beginning of how it was a welcome retreat from kind of the day to day, but I meant on a much deeper level too. Like I think we are at an inflection point in many ways right now, a quarter of a way through this century, where it would do many of us a great deal of good, especially those of us that live up here a lot, to slow down a bit and appreciate kind of the cycles of nature, the cycles of silence, and how we can actually think more deeply and feel more deeply when we're stopping and smelling the proverbial roses. Another quote that I love, you write, "How else can you stick with something for years with no promise that anything will come of it? That's what it's like to be a writer, and I guess restore a meadow." Right, this is what I mean when I talk to you about, you kind of didn't know that this was going to be a project that would go as far and wide, but certainly not something that you set out and said, I have a feeling this is going to turn into a book. But as you had these experiences, and I said chicken egg, there's got to be a better formulation for how much of this was circumstances dictating, but also kind of your inevitable nature, as your sensibility as a writer and a thinker and a feeler. There would seem to just be this natural overlap at a certain point, because you were experiencing kind of blue sky phenomenon, and you're relaying this throughout the book as it's happening to you. um, but you're also bringing your writing into that, and there's just this inevitable, you're reporting it as a writer, and I found that to be very inspiring, that there wasn't a separation, and that's maybe the way we all should be more in that Tolstoyan ideal of like just living in the moment and letting our nature flow through that perception.
There was a point when I realized, um, when I was trying to structure various chapters, and my style of writing initially is very meandering, and I'll follow various tangents, and I tend to write a lot and then cut a lot. And at some point, my editor said, "Oh, I get it. You're a meanderer." And I hadn't really thought of it with that particular term in mind, but I knew that that's how I write. I follow these weird little paths, and a lot of times, a chapter or a story or an essay could be restructured in any number of ways and still like basically say the same thing. So so it was a challenge to figure out like the right structure. But at the same time, I realized, okay, the way that I'm learning about this place, and one of my favorite things to do here is like the discovery mode of meandering through the meadow and stopping and staring at every plant until I see the beetle and the spider that are, that are sitting on it, and trying to figure out what they're doing there. And it's that attention and noticing and curiosity. It's the same as writing, and for me, it's the same meandering that I do in my head when I write that comes out on paper. It was the exact same process in many ways.
I'm curious, Paula, like, so clearly for this project, what I just described, the proof is in the pages, but have you found that even your writing process has inevitably been impacted and changed from the last several years in experience?
Um, Well, it was very different writing a full-length book of nonfiction than a full-length book of fiction. So in that
Sure.
sense, yes. And I will say I'm not very tempted to go back to fiction. Um, my next book that the next book I have in mind is nonfiction, and I thought um, I thought that I would have a lot of trouble because in order to really structure things, I had to eventually write outlines.
Yes.
And I never wrote outlines for fiction, and I rarely even wrote for shorter nonfiction pieces. It just wasn't, I wanted to see where it was going as it went there. I didn't want to know anything in advance. And really, with this project in this book, I didn't know anything in advance. I couldn't have known if I wanted to. And so, but I wondered how writing outlines would change that. But really what happened was I would just keep changing the outline. The outline would just evolve at the same time the chapter evolved. And I would just sort of like do a rough outline so I could make sure I was getting in, everything that needed to be there, and to look at the organization, of it, and make sure it was the most effective organization that I could think of. So has it changed my right? I mean, in a sense, it did, in that I'm not really, still love to read fiction constantly, but I'm not drawn to writing it. And, who knows if that will change, but I was in the middle of writing a novel when I started doing the work on the mountain. And I became so obsessed with the mountain project. It was that same, like the deep dive that I was talking about. The mountain was the deep dive. The relationships among the creatures and plants, the interconnections I was discovering, those were all these like mini deep dives within these larger deep dives. And that's the same kind of energy that I have to bring to a writing project. I have to be completely preoccupied with it and completely focused on it, not able to think about anything else. So it's running in my head all the time. And the mountain and everything here was running in my head all the time. That's what was preoccupying me. And so, that's why a few months into it, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to write anything else. And that this was going to have to be the thing that I wrote, that this was going to be the book, whether I wanted to publish it or read it. I wasn't sure, but but I was going to write it.
Yeah, and I mean, clearly it was a labor of love, but we need to linger on the labor part. I think another corrective and why this book is seems particularly timely for our current moment. I've personally been kind of semi-obsessed the last few years with kind of developing a thesis around like everything from politics to business as always, but even like the arts increasingly. And I don't blame this on AI. I think that's just a partial manifestation, but this notion of shortcuts and hacks. Like if we're smart
Mm.
enough, what's the hack? And I get asked a lot. I have been over the years asked a lot as a writer, like, yeah, but what can I learn from you to master this? And I always appreciate the question, but I usually just turn it around and say, would you ever go up to like a concert violinist and say, yeah, but how do I do that? Or to a professional basketball player and say, yeah, but how do I learn how to shoot like that? I think what this book just illustrates, the whole show don't tell, is that when you're dealing with nature and you have so many, it's one story after another, of the challenges, the ceaseless, the recurring challenges, right? The cycles of nature. But then it's like literally every corner you turn, it's either a plant or a bush or an insect or a weather related event. There's all these challenges. So again, I want to stress I didn't come away remotely with the feeling of kind of helplessness so much as this humility of like there's no hack. You need to be you need to talk to experts, which you do. You need to experience and get in there, get your hands dirty. But you also have to have a certain remove that there's not going to be a type A 21st century American, like, yeah, but who do I pay to make this go away? And it's like when you're on the mountain, there's no guarantees, and money does not solve problems.
Yeah, all the bears are probably gathered with the bobcats and so on, going, how do we make her go away?
Right? Well, actually, that's actually a great segue into you because of like I think everyone that's watching now is getting a sense of your humane, like your gentle, loving nature. But there is again, and I don't want to keep using this word, but it's so genuinely offered this genuine humility. Like you're very cognizant of all the life, it's not just the insects and the invisible creatures that have like been on that path, but you make the reader aware like you're not in your turf. You're encroaching on an environment that has lived kind of uninterrupted in some ways for centuries. And that does require a certain like remove and a certain like well humility. I have to keep coming back to that word.
That's true. As I said, I've lived in the city, I've lived in the suburbs. Now I'm living on a mountain, and in the suburbs, it was very much about control. And uh, and now I'm realizing how, wrong-headed that was. As far as like, well, now the one thing I would want to control is to, um, replace more of the lawn with native plants. But as far as like being on this mountain, all of this had been going on way before I got there and evolving in certain directions. And it's gonna keep going after I'm gone. And I can only hope that this, small blip in the timeline then where I'm trying to do something will maybe help manage it in a good direction for the years to come. But but the yeah, the wildlife there, uh, it's very interesting. I didn't have a house there for the first 3+ years. There was no house, there was no power, there was no water. I'd have to bring in all the water that I needed, um, and I would, you know, work. There was no bathroom, and so. Uh,
Again, glamping. I'm like check please.
and like I said, my husband's an Eagle Scout, and he would camp out there sometimes, and a storm would roll in, which happened a lot, and there was no place to go. You were just in the middle of it. I'm not good at sleeping on the ground anymore, so I didn't. I would usually go home at the end of the day, which would mean, say, I would have spent the whole day like pulling weeds in some weird spot and trying to pull up saplings or maybe cut things. And I would be like covered with sweat. My clothes would be torn with thorns. I would, bramble and, dirt and all this stuff. And I'd be exhausted, but it would feel like, oh, okay, I actually did something. I'm actually doing something, even if it's this little teeny tiny bit of progress, and even if sometimes I'd come back the next day or a couple of days later and find that something undid what I did,
Yeah.
it would still feel like I was somehow ahead, because if I hadn't done that, well, it would have been worse.
Right. We've talked about this disparity of the suburbs and the cities. I think so much of our Western human behavior has been about control. But it occurs to me talking to you now, and it occurred to me when I was reading it, but it really hit me that control is absolutely a critical component. But even the impulse for control, I think many of us, right, are just running away from death. And what could be, more of an impetus for wanting to control one's environment than removing anything that reminds us how insignificant we are. And maybe that's what I'm was kind of inelegantly getting at earlier when I was
Mm,
talking about how it obliges you to not only slow down, but to be cognizant of how meaningless we are in the grand scheme of things. And again, I think there's some people that are horrified and terrified by that. But I think I find something tremendously beautiful and liberating in that.
yeah, it's all going to go on after I'm gone. And the Blue Ridge, which has been there for 1 billion years, And the meadow, which has been here for, well, I'm not really sure how long, because I had a scientist who studies grasslands tell me it was definitely open meadow on top of this mountain far longer than when it was made into an orchard in the 1830s. It would have been being kept meadow, kept as savanna by lightning-induced fires. And that would have been happening before, people would have been here to do cultural burns. And so, yeah, it's humbling, and it also is comforting to know that something has been here for 1 billion years, and I could really screw up, but it'll probably still be here in some form. At least the rats, the deer, the mice will probably be here.
Absolutely. I'm gonna preface this remark by saying this is absolutely coming from someone like me meant in a positive and complimentary way. When you start going really deep on weeds and soil, it inevitably reminded me a bit of Moby Dick.
Ah,
The reason I say I mean it because I love the book, but I think unfortunately that's usually shorthand for people that haven't read the book or don't like it. But we discover as we're reading in real time that for you a little wasn't going to be enough, and it necessitated an intimate knowledge. So I wanted you to talk a little bit, if you would, about research, how it's depicted. You've talked a little bit about how some of this is consistent with your natural sensibility, um, but you had to become informed, and then you had to translate that to the page. But we're not getting this is almost like a buyer beware, right? If you're gonna go on this journey with Paula, get an education and in many senses of the word. I have to imagine that because you were going through this, it was passionate, but you obviously have there's something to you that loves the research, right? And loves you can't go a third of the way in. You're going all in.
yeah, and believe me, I left stuff out.
Well, oh yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, I really wanted people to feel um, that that they were coming to an understanding of things in a way similar to how I came to an understanding of them. So there's one chapter where I go to this talk outside in Virginia under some power lines, some of those high power lines, and because there was a uniquely preserved native prairie remnant in this one spot. And there was a speaker there who was, he was holding up this little whiteboard and writing on and scribbling all these charts really quickly. And every once in a while, people would run up to and this was in April. So plants were really just starting to emerge. And they would find this little tiny plant, like size of my fingernail, and they'd go, "Oh, it's a such and such." And they would always use the Latin term. And I still don't know the Latin terms for most things. So, and I was just completely at sea. I had no idea what was going on, but certain things started to sink in. And that's when I started to understand that I just needed to ask more questions, that I really did need to understand this stuff about, well, why was this prairie remnant here? Why did it go away in other places? What was it about the soil that was so important? And learning about, for instance, that the whole South was full of prairies, was full of grasslands, like even richer tall grass prairie than the Midwest, was like a pretty amazing thing to learn, because we always assume that certain parts have been forested forever, or we can't imagine things beyond our earliest memory of them. That's like our baseline. And so I I guess I researched to a fault, maybe, in that I like to read everything I can find, and I don't always understand it. I'm reading these scientific studies by soil scientists, and I don't necessarily know the terminology, so then I'm looking up the terms to see what they mean, and I know that not everyone needs to know all that. Uh, and I also want to emphasize that I was never a gardener, and I talk about that in the book. I was terrible with plants. I was always killing them, or I would plant them and they would never come back. And sort of like, what's great about this? What's so fun about this? I don't understand. So I really came to it, and which is not to say I don't appreciate other people's gardens. Other people who are good at it, they're beautiful, but I was just never good at it, and I could never like get into it as a thing,
Yeah,
even though it's a very big Washington thing,
sure,
gardening.
sure.
And so that was sort of like what I'm doing isn't gardening. So that's a distinction. Um, and that was sort of important to me to realize also, that it didn't matter how bad I was at gardening. It didn't matter that, I somehow killed the frogs in the terrarium I was trying to raise. I could do better. I could learn, and I could do better.
Yeah.
Uh, and if we're not always advancing, if we're not always learning, then what are we doing here? That's how I think of it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I want to make sure I make clear to those watching, it's obvious that an abundance of research has gone into both this education we're discussing, but also the book itself. But Paula renders it very accessible. So it's a deep dive kind of spiritually, but this is not a book about plants and soil, but inevitably, inexorably, these things are part and parcel of the day-to-day experience. Um, I'll give one example of something like raise my hand and admit my own colossal ignorance by admitting that um, it wasn't lost on me in the current ongoing, seemingly never-ending discussion about immigrants, illegal or otherwise, in this country, which is, e pluribus unum. But I had no idea the extent to which so many of our crops are non-native, and you definitely talk a bit about that. Um, what a revelation to understand that even America, as we know it, or thinking about back in the day of America, it was a very different country before more people were here.
Well, and really, ever since the beginning of human existence, humans are mobile. We move around. We always have. We're more mobile than most other species as far as the distance we can migrate, and we bring our plants with us. We bring our animals with us on purpose and by accident. And uh, for a long time, it didn't matter so much because there weren't that many of us, and we weren't as efficiently mobile. But once the continent was colonized and Europeans came in, they brought their plants, they brought their animals, they brought their accidental travelers, um, and we know what happened and what they did to the people who were here before them, who were, you know, here in such smaller numbers and were more subsistence, farming. Whereas in the South, all those prairies, all those grasslands became, basically fell victim to European farming methods. And as soon as European plowing started, those grasslands were erased. And once you plow the soil, it's damaged, um, beyond return to what was there before. So a lot of people might think, oh, well, I grew up here, it was all forest. How can you say it was supposed to be grassland? But what happened was, after years and years of plowing and row crops and so on, uh, when hard economic times came and farmers had to abandon their land because the soil was so irrevocably changed, the land would succeed. It would move through the various stages until it grew into closed canopy forest, because you no longer had the organisms or the seed bank to support prairie plants. But the evidence is there in the fossil record that there
Mhm.
were, the abundance of prairie plants. And yeah, I'm not sure where I was going with that, but
Well, I had mentioned how, even assumptions we'd make about a more primitive state of America, the landscape has changed so much over the years. And I guess to strain the metaphor, although it seems very appropriate, just as America is comprised of people from all these different places that have kind of become one thing, American soil and topography is also kind of a mismatch of all these different influences and different cultures and continents. I just find something so amazing about that. And I still think America stands as an exemplar of how so many different things are represented. And the soil and the people have just transformed, kind of reflecting that over time.
I think though, I mean, I see what you mean. It's the reason it's a tricky metaphor is because when you introduce people into a place, the food there, the land can support them no matter where they're from. It doesn't matter. But when you introduce plants from another continent, the land can't support them. What happens is the native insects and wildlife that need the native plants because they evolved with those plants. They balance each other, they feed each other. Invasive plants push out their food plants, and the native creatures die out. And that, you know, and if that doesn't matter to you, just, because sometimes we need it to be about us, then it matters because our food supply relies on a lot of those pollinators. Honeybees are not native to the North America. Bumblebees and many species of specialist bee, butterfly, even birds, dragonflies, all of these creatures are pollinators. And if they die out, we won't have blueberries, we won't have tomatoes, we won't have a lot of fruit plants. A lot of our food plants will be gone. Whereas it really doesn't matter who's eating them. I mean, human wise, but it does matter what can grow in the soil.
Yep. Yep. See, folks, this is what I'm talking about. Even if you consider yourself the ultimate urban mouse or city mouse, you're going to come away with not only an awareness, but I think a deeper appreciation for um, how interwoven all of these different aspects of nature and people are. Paula, I want to, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you at least once, because it's germane to the broader focus of what you and I have done as writers and literary citizens. Curious, how it feels to have a book coming out in 2025. You've been in this industry, part of the industry. Everyone you talk to these days has a different experience, a different opinion, but if a lot of the news is bad, I think books like yours are proving that books that should be written have to be written, are being written and being exposed to the world. But it is tough out there. How are you dealing with the inevitable, the roller coaster of excitement and I won't even use a word, just excitement and
Doom.
responsibility that comes with having to promote and try to help an audience discover the work that you're writing?
Well, I think and hope that my book has a hopeful perspective. And that is something that I personally welcome at any moment, but particularly at this moment. I think we need something to be hopeful about. And um, planting native plants, encouraging native bees and butterflies and birds wherever you live, to me is a hopeful act. And it's an act that if you do it, you and you see what comes to that plant and what comes of that plant,
Mhm.
you can point to that and say, this wouldn't have happened if I hadn't done it. You don't need 200 acres to make a difference. You can do it in your backyard, in your window box, in a pot on your patio, and and it can give you something to feel good about and feel positive about.
Yeah. Here, here. I love it. I'm also curious, both, everything about your background, but specifically your involvement with the aforementioned literary magazine. Community is very important to you, literary community. You are what I would, define as an ideal literary citizen in that
Oh,
you are part of that world, but you're also very eager and able to support other writers. Um, Being on the mountain, I know in this day and age, we have devices that enable us to be connected, but I'm curious if there's been a part of you that misses. Talk a little bit about the solitary life of the writer and the naturalist versus, the needs or desires of being part of a literary community and how you're continuing to balance those two kind of impulses.
well, that's a great question. My house was only finished a few months ago, so being able to live here has made a huge difference. Just being able to get up in the morning and start what I want to do and not worry about driving home exhausted is huge.
Yeah.
Um, and the other thing about this community is that it's it's a very active, volunteer-centered community. So there is a very active arts community here. There's a very active conservation focused community here. And, a bunch of people are interested in things like regenerative agriculture, which is conservation focused farming. And it's a very interesting place to be. So I don't really feel isolated. The only time I feel isolated is when there's a snowstorm or an ice storm, like there was about 10 days ago when um, my power went out, my generator failed, there were trees down all over my road, and I was basically trapped and cold with no internet.
Well, and talk about, I mean, good gracious, going back to nature. I think even for us, more suburban focused folk, all it takes is a quick power outage to remind us how reliant we are in every sense on electricity and all the conveniences of modern life. But having power out, even for a short time, is maybe a good corrective for anyone to just kind of remember how easy life is now in a lot of ways.
It's true. It is really true. And uh, you try to build in all of these um, fail-safe systems, but nothing is completely fail-safe. I mean, look at all of the natural disasters that are happening. Um, you just never know really what's going to happen, and it can happen anywhere.
Yeah,
So why not be on a mountain, I guess?
for sure, for sure. Yeah, so I think we've covered all of it. I'm curious, finally, I kind of alluded to, the people that I'm talking to now, and I include you, well, for a variety of reasons. But I mean, when I say that you have skin in the game again as a published, respected writer, as someone that's nurtured and helped other writers. So I mean, you're a part of this literary world. These days, when I talk to academics, artists, or just readers, there's all this concern about AI. There's all this concern about humanities under attack. A tremendous amount of uncertainty about the industry itself. Do you have a take on
Oh.
like where we are,
Well,
or
do I have a take?
bring it on? I'd love to
Well,
hear just kind of
oh
where
my
your head is
gosh.
at.
You know,
Definitely.
as the It really distresses me the number of colleges and universities that are tanking their humanities um, courses. I just think it's so wrongheaded and backward thinking. It's where we learn our critical thinking skills. It's where we learn critical analysis. And uh, how do we fight disinformation and propaganda if not by being skilled in critical analysis and critical thinking? It's really important. And it's also useful in pretty much every career. I don't understand people who say studying literature isn't useful. Studying literature teaches you about humans, it teaches you about people, it teaches you about motivation. Um, if you put aside the entertainment part of it, I learned so much from reading over the years. That was probably one of the main ways I learned anything when I was growing up. And it just distresses me now that so many students won't have that opportunity, that it's it seems like a shrinking and deflating of human possibility and potential.
Ooh, well put. I mean, so they say those that don't know history are doomed to repeat it. I don't think I coined this, but I like to say those that don't read literature are doomed to inspire it. And that's a good thing. I couldn't agree more. And I guess I find a real nugget of hope that because of what we've seen this last year, depending on how you look at it, these last years, I think a tide might start to shift where it always comes down to money. And I think employers are recognizing this lack of critical thinking, this lack of organization, this lack of compelling communication. So I don't know if that will necessarily rejuvenate the humanities, but I think it will remind Americans from a more top down foundation that these are very important to culture and society. This is not just art for art's sake or something of the mind. Like these are critical things that help a society thrive. So I guess yeah, I do find hope that as things have gotten kind of bleak, maybe that's what it always takes for Americans to figure out it's got to get bad before we recognize it could be better and it should be better. And boy, I wasn't trying to tee it up on a platter like that, but how very much like your book in the sense of the cycles of evolution and nature and things burning and then regrowing. But I do find some hope there.
I also just think that well, I've always felt this way, that we communicate with each other through stories. And if we don't have that example of stories told in many different voices, diverse voices, international voices from all walks of life, then we're really cheating ourselves and we're missing so much. We're missing so much of the human experience, but we're also losing a way of communicating if we farm out, our emails or our, anything to artificial intelligence. It's artificial. It's called artificial intelligence. It's not real intelligence. And the way I became a writer was in part because my parents modeled storytelling. That is and was how they communicate. They tell stories about their lives. My grandmother, who I grew up living with, told stories about her life. And, I couldn't imagine not living in that environment. But that was the model that I had, that storytelling was the way we communicate.
Well, you talked about fiction and not being certain that you're going to go back to that. As someone that has written a great deal of fiction and nonfiction, I have to say, Paula, that I think choosing to write this book and choosing to do it the way you did it is a very generous act. I feel like, I mean, I don't know. This certainly could have been rendered, or some of this material could have been, plumbed for some fictional narrative. But there's something so immediate and necessary, I think, of the here and now of relaying this type of story and the epiphanies that you had and the observations and kind of the very subtle but the implications about how this can reverberate both immediately and down the road. Um, there's just something very necessary and timely and generous about this book. So I want to thank you again for. I'd like to think that I didn't need my eyes opened wider, but nevertheless, these moments of instruction and inspiration are always welcome and always warmly received. And I'm very confident that the readers that this book finds are going to be very grateful.
Oh, thank you so much. That's wonderful to hear.
So I will put it in all the material when I do my summing up and sharing on social, but tell folks watching right now, I've already said get this book everywhere you can find books, but how do they find you online and get caught up with you and the stuff that you've been working on both but recently and in the past?
You can find me at paulawhyman.com, and that's Wyman with an H, like Y man. I also I write a monthly newsletter called the Bad Naturalist newsletter, which is free, and it's sort of the continuing story of what I'm seeing and discovering and doing on the mountain. Also, I talk about book news in there occasionally when there is book news. But yeah, anyway, it's free and you can subscribe on my website. There are a lot of photos, and there's always a photo of my standard poodle.
Yeah.
And my events are listed on my website, my socials. I guess I'm most active on Instagram and Blue Sky. And um, oh, and I'm available for book clubs. So you can always like write to me and ask me, and I can either, come remotely or in person or whatever. Love doing that.
Outstanding. Well, conversation to be continued, but folks, I hope I've done an adequate job of convincing you need to check this book out. Again, even or especially if you don't think that you're the type of person that would want to read about the education of a mountainside. It's about a lot more than that, but being reminded of how little we know and how much we can know and get to know ourselves better. Very timely, relevant stuff. So Paula, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
As I've told you, you have been a force of inspiration. You will continue to be so. But I really look forward to seeing the people that are going to read this book and kind of have their lives changed.
Oh, thank you so much. That's really wonderful to hear. And I really enjoyed our conversation.
Right on. All right. Well, I'll see you soon. Everybody, thanks for checking out Some Things Considered. Again, go to seanmurphy.net to find out more about what I do, how to be part of this podcast. If you've got ideas or you want to be a guest, let me know. Stay safe, support our artists, be kind to each other, take care, and we will see you soon. Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Find out more, including how to be a guest, at seanmurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. Also, we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. Drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. I'm Sean Murphy. See you on the next episode of Some Things Considered.